Hey Veritas, thanks for your response. I guess I'll begin by just saying that referring to consciousness as though it were a substance, as though it were something that particular objects like human bodies or other animals have, I think is not where I'm trying to go with this. That is the traditional way we think about it, and it's difficult not to think of it that way. But part of pan-experientialism is something called process philosophy, which is an attempt to reorient ourselves into thinking of the basic components of reality as events rather than things or nouns. And so instead of thinking of consciousness as some thing, it is part of a process which extends beyond the skull of human beings, of any animal or of any organism or holon that is conscious, out into the world, so that whenever we have a conscious experience, it's not something produced by the brain. It's what arises because of this extended relationship between my perceptual system and the world being perceived, and there's no separation or gap between the two. And this sort of implies, or it assumes, that anything that is a process, a whole process, is an occasion of experience. It evokes an experiential state. It is not just a happening with no perspective or nobody there to experience it. So I'm not saying atoms have consciousness. I'm saying atoms participate in events which, due to the nature of time, such that an atom, to know what to do next, must also have a memory of its past and an ability to project into the future at some very basic level. That's how particles interact with each other. We never find a particle in isolation. We never find anything in isolation, and part of the process ontology is that all objects are related. No objects exist in a vacuum independently of other objects. In a sense, it's like everything reflects everything else. And what constitutes a conscious experience is when, say, a human observer sees the color of the blue sky. My organism and that environment conspire together to create the experience, the conscious state of me looking at a blue sky. So let's move to the anthropomorphism of atoms issue. You're saying it's up to me to prove that atoms do have consciousness, rather than for you to prove that they don't, because I'm making a positive claim, whereas you're just making a negative claim, and somehow a negative claim does not require evidence, because you say it's a lot easier to think of matter or atoms as not conscious than to think of them as conscious. And again, bearing in mind everything I said about how I'm trying to look at consciousness as a process that extends out into the world and is not a substance that somehow the brain creates, atoms have this. They participate in the arising of consciousness. I could just as easily say you have to prove that atoms are inert, because that's basically what you're saying, and that is a positive claim, that atoms are inert. They have no inner activity. They just respond to external forces. I think there are reasons, mostly out of quantum physics, to assume that atoms are not inert, that in fact they do spontaneously pop into and out of existence. For example, they are somehow correlated non-locally. There's all these interesting quantum properties of particles that suggest to me that they are not inert. So I would just reverse this trick and say you have to prove that atoms are inert, because you're making a positive claim in that regard. As far as us not knowing the mechanism of consciousness, and therefore not really having any ground to stand on to have any of these conversations. Um, the problem of consciousness is still a problem, precisely because it confounds the mechanistic metaphor. Descartes is really the person who started this problem to begin with, by separating the material, mechanical world from the spiritual, conscious self. And he was right to see that material matter is extended in space, and that consciousness is not. It's damn near invisible, which is why we can't really study it as we study other mechanisms. Some would say we cannot study consciousness empirically because you cannot sense it with your five senses. I would disagree, but it's just basically changing the terminology a little bit, or tweaking the terminology. William James had an idea, a concept called radical empiricism, which allows us to see our mental states, our experiential states, as just as much a part of empirical reality as anything we sense with our eyes, our ears, our nose, or whatever. It just is, in a sense, it's an internal empiricism, hence radical. And so we do have access to consciousness, but it is not mechanical. We cannot use the mechanistic metaphor to understand consciousness. We will never understand the mechanism of consciousness because there isn't one. There is certainly behavioral mechanisms that we can sort of correlate with how a body behaves based on its environment and the structure of the brain, but that's not going to help us much with consciousness, because consciousness is, in a sense, invisible. It's the interior of objects, of material objects. It is what sees, not what is seen. So, do we understand consciousness right now? It is what does the understanding. I think we've understood consciousness for thousands of years. It's just that when we apply what we call the modern scientific method to consciousness, we get all confused and flustered, because Descartes, who was essentially the guy that started science, or Galileo before him, and Newton just after him, really codified the whole thing. But it's their metaphysics, the idea that anything that cannot be measured is not real, and that nature is basically a giant clock with gears and such. It's that idea that makes consciousness somehow mysterious and unknown. Human beings have had a relationship with consciousness from an experiential standpoint way before, the 17th century. And so I would say we do have what you might call a religious understanding, and I would call it a contemplative understanding of consciousness. It's consciousness from the inside out, understood from the inside out rather than from the outside in, as science typically tries to understand the world, because that type of scientific method, which says that only things which can be measured are real, and only things which can be observed empirically in the traditional sense, not in William James' sense, are real, that type of science would never find consciousness. And in fact, if you go back to the behaviorism of the early 20th century, that was the scientific method of Descartes, minus the spiritual soul stuff, just the mechanistic half, to a T. That was the best that version of science can do in regards to explaining how organisms behave the way they do. And what it did was just say consciousness doesn't exist, and there are still forms of this in the Churchland's eliminative materialism. There are neuroscientists who say that consciousness is just a way of talking about our experience, when really we don't have experience. There are just objective brain states that eventually we'll measure and understand, such that all this talk of beliefs and feelings and images and this will all just be sort of put into the past, and we'll move on into a brighter human future where all we talk about is amygdala and prefrontal cortex and visual lobe and all this. I don't understand what the hell they're talking about, but that is what materialistic mechanistic science does with consciousness. It doesn't acknowledge it. It says it's not real.